Now let's move away from structure and tectonics and get into um, something else. Let's start on some of the cool things that happened during the Archean, such as perhaps the origins of life itself. Now, if you were to go to the a hypothetical shopping market and you wanted to shop for the ingredients of life, what would you get? Well, first, the one thing that essentially makes up who we are uh, is protein. Protein goes into cells, making uh, essentially who we are. And so, how do we make these proteins? Well, we can get amino acids. These amino acids assist chemical reactions, organisms. They're also the building blocks of proteins. So we can pick that up along the way. Also, we need nucleic acids. These large, complex molecules that are found in the nuclei of cells are essentially the building codes by which proteins assemble. RNA and DNA are what code and what tells essentially those proteins to make what they make. We need organic phosphorus. We can have everything else, but if we don't have phosphorus, we have no way of essentially taking the food that we eat and putting it into energy. Phosphorus is a large limiting substance, or a large limiting element, especially in the oceans themselves, as well for us. We also need a container. You can't just pour everything out and hope it coagulates. You need some form of cell components that are isolated away from its environment, something that might be able to protect it, if you will, or um, contain those reactions or those interactions, if you will, of the cell itself. Outside of just the ingredients, you also need environmental conditions. How are you going to spark, if you will? How are you going to nudge this reaction forward? Well, the environmental conditions at the time were that the early Earth was being bathed in ultraviolet radiation. Again, there's no ozone until a little bit later, and so the ultraviolet radiation, ultraviolet light, is allowed to essentially separate water, ammonia, and hydrocarbon mixtures. And what it combines back into are amino acids. Now, amino acids aren't life itself, but remember, chains of amino acids go into proteins, and these proteins can, well, we can go from there. Now, ultraviolet radiation can do this, but also lightning can do the same thing. Add a little spark to the mix, and you can get that separation of water, ammonia, and hydrocarbon mixtures, and that recombination of all of that into amino acids. And then there's also another component. When you look up out into space, you largely think that it's just devoid of any organic material whatsoever. Chemically speaking, there are a lot of organic molecules that are out there in space. A lot of amino acids that can be delivered by a falling meteorite or two, if you will. Or a meteorite, a falling meteor. So some have suggested an extraterrestrial origin for life on Earth. Most suggest an origin from Mars, if you will. But how do you get from amino acid, that production of amino acids, to proteins? Because amino acids are one thing, but you have to align these amino acids into a chain-like structure to even think about forming proteins. Well, the funny thing is that experiments on clay particles interacting with amino acids suggest that these proteins might have formed initially on clay particles. The surfaces of clay include essentially metallic ions that can concentrate organic molecules, and they do so under observation in these experiments in a very orderly alignment, essentially looking almost like the precursor to protein chain-like structures. And so this is a very cool type of thing to be able to see. But again, we can get to an amino acid to a protein by envisioning these types of interactions going on. Now, how might we be able to produce a homegrown amino acid? Well, you have to have the ingredients, right? You have to have the environmental conditions. So let's see if that works. Let's see if the chemical conditions and the environmental conditions are right. And that's just what one researcher did. The Miller-Urey experiments of the 70s, 60s, and 70s are very good examples of the synthesis of amino acids. They essentially simulated Earth's early atmosphere by compartmentalizing methane, ammonia, water vapor, hydrogen, and then releasing it into a larger flask. Then they subjected this mixture of the Earth's early atmosphere to environmental controls. They could let it undergo high doses of ultraviolet radiation, or in this case, they essentially simulated lightning by discharges of electricity. And what the experiment produced was a plethora of organic molecules and amino acids. The one caveat to this, though, is that they did not include oxygen. Again, in Earth's early atmosphere, there is no oxygen to be found. We've already seen evidence of that in the rocks themselves. What happened when oxygen was introduced into the mix? Well, amino acids, organic molecules, were not created. What was created was just essentially the equivalent of smog or pollution. Miller later did experiments, very similar experiments, and was using H2S or hydrosulfide as well later on in the mix, another volatile that comes from volcanic eruptions, and was still producing the organic molecules and the amino acids. He passed away in 2007, but he essentially willed or loaned the products of his experiment to his PhD student at the time, who had later on, later moved on, of course. But once he received these these products, he was able to go back and essentially look back at the amino acids and the products of their experiments and find that in fact we're actually finding more amino acids than what they thought. They're finding an abundance of things, and it's still producing wonderful results today. You can actually go through the process of simulating this and producing results within a week, where this would take, maybe 2 weeks or so. Well, by now, you've probably come across the organic soup hypothesis. And if you're a fan of Seinfeld, then you'll get the joke. No soup for you. But the original theories in the origin of life were essentially the organic soup and organic rich broth, this primordial ocean that was teeming with the chemicals necessary for life, the self-replicating organisms that or DNA or RNA that came from that. But what would the presence of free molecular oxygen suggest? It would suggest that if there was any free molecular oxygen around at the time, that it would destroy the compounds that needed for life. It would not allow organic molecules or amino acids to form. So what then? No soup? Well, we can think about other regions that may provide a likely spot for these chemical reactions, these physical interactions to occur. Think about mid-ocean ridges. They're very well separated out from any free molecular oxygen at that time. They contain hot waters, contain an abundance of elements that's needed for life. They're set up, like I said, they're set away from the oxygen, so we just can imagine some other places. Or it could just be that the free molecular oxygen at the time was not enough to really destroy or disrupt much of these reactions. We can also take a look at the chemistry of our cells, the sodium and potassium. If the original cell, the original organism, if you will, was first originated in primordial ocean, then you would expect a certain ratio of sodium to potassium. That's not what you see, though. You see a higher ratio of potassium than sodium. And so that also raises the question, what are environments that might have higher potassium to sodium ratios that might betray where some of or the origin of life may have occurred? If you would like, I do have a paper that suggests the spring-fed pool hypothesis, where we actually find these ratios, these chemical ratios. But this is a very hot topic for some, and very much open for debate. A lot of fun hypotheses that can be thrown about. But this is the mid-ocean ridges that are producing the elements needed, at least in the ocean, for sustainable life. But again, it's another working hypothesis. Once we get down into the oceans, once we have already essentially found the origination of these self-replicating, self-reproducing organisms, then that's when evolution can take place. Evolution acts to select, essentially, the radiation and the extinction of life. It's descent with modification, the processes that we've talked about already. Can't happen before life exists. But nonetheless, we can take a look at what life does exist within these settings, specifically like mid-ocean ridges. The life that exists down there is fairly hardy, and by these vents that are venting off material from the mantle there by the mid-ocean ridges, we find these creatures that we call hypothermophiles, or extremophiles, really, for lack of a better word, and an all-encompassing type of word. These creatures live in seawater that exceeds 100 degrees Celsius. It's only because of the pressure of that depth that the water is not boiling, but nonetheless, it is at boiling temperature. There's no light for photosynthesis. So how is it that these hypothermophiles survive? There's no base of food chain. I mean, when we think about the base of the food chain here on land, we generally think about photosynthesizing plants. So if there's no photosynthesis going down there, what's their survival? How do they survive?